Hi and welcome, everybody. I'm Sally Wilson, and I have with me as my very special guest today, Dr. Nilmini Fernando. Welcome, Nilmini.
Oh, thank you, Sally. It's just lovely to be here. Yeah.
So, listeners, if you don't know about this woman, she has an awful lot of experience and an awful lot of areas of expertise under her belt. And she's currently a research fellow and adjunct fellow at the Griffith Centre for Social and Cultural Research at Griffith University. She also does consultation and education and research around feminism and anti-racism. So we have a lot to talk about.
Yes.
So to start with, Nilmini, could you please define for us both racism and feminism?
Oh, I'd love to, because I think, thanks for asking that question, Sally, because a lot of people have been told probably a part of the information about both feminism and racism. They are two of the most scary isms around. And part of that, I believe, they've been given a bad reputation as well, and made to sound very scary, when really feminism, let's start with feminism. Feminism is the idea that by women and gender and non-binary people who identify not as men, not as white patriarchal men, that they will, that the whole of society will improve. So it's not just about making women's lives better by giving women the access and the full range of rights and opportunities, not just for work. It's actually also just to make knowledge, to think, to define their lives for themselves rather than being squeezed into a box. So that is the first thing that people kind of get confused about feminism. They think it's about women's rights, it's about destroying men, it's only for women. It's for all of society, because at the moment it's very unbalanced. And there's a lot of damage, there's a lot of harm, there's a lot of trauma, and there's a lot of violence. So I guess violence and poverty are the two things that women that really bring this home. That is why I'm a feminist, because I see that going on, and I feel that I have some contribution to make into understanding why it's happening. So that's where the analysis and the study comes in. Just learning to read a situation, what are the causes of this, and then being able to create it's not just going around empowering women. You can't just wave a magic wand. It's about creating the looking at the circumstances cause their oppression or their marginalization, push them to the outside, push them to the corner, push them down that ladder of opportunity. What are those conditions? And then how can you change those conditions in order to let women themselves, who know what they want, we're not dumb, to be able to flower. So that is the main thing. That is why I'm a feminist. And I'm a feminist academic, because I really felt that feminism has been given, like when you just rely on mainstream media, or there's a lot of anti-feminism and weak understandings. And most importantly, there's only one type of feminism, and that's the one that is quite handy, for capitalism and for everybody else. And we don't understand all the other kinds of feminism. So feminism, as I think Bell Hooks is my favorite feminist writer, one of them, she would say it's women's movement. It's not a women's movement. It's when women move to improve their circumstances and for themselves, their families, and for society. So there are many feminisms. Now, racism, like feminism, it's one of the main ways that society is structured. So we're looking at the big kind of sort of big categories that people are put into very unconsciously sometimes. And we don't put ourselves in there. We are put in there, which means that you can't really escape. So it's one of the big, what I would call master categories, like gender, women, men, race is that. And in that equation, what we'll find is that artificially created one race to be superior to all the other races. So that is racism, is when there are things and processes and laws done to society through which certain groups are uplifted according to their race and others are pressed down according to their race. So it's always the white colonialism did this, basically. Racism emerged through the colonial kind of period. So it pushes whiteness, not just white people or white skin, but the idea of whiteness up to the top and push down any others down to the bottom. So that's kind of what I would say. Race and gender are sort of categories that corral us into different parts of society. And based on that, we get deprived of opportunities and rights and freedoms. Is that too complicated or?
No, not at all. And I'm interested. So when and listeners have heard this story about me, when I was 18, I went over and lived in Japan for a year because I actually wanted to experience living somewhere where I was not in the majority. My race was not in the majority, right? And when I was over there, it was kind of like, oh, wow, okay, so this is what racism feels like. A lot of the time when I felt subjected to it, it was absolutely unintentioned from the people who I felt it from. And this was at a time in Japan where, most Japanese people's perceptions of white women were based on billboards and advertising and that kind of thing. So racism, even more broadly than the colonial, what's happened through colonization, to me, I don't know about you, and I'm interested in the research, but to me, it feels like something that is based on misunderstanding and on fear.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Please correct me if you think I'm wrong and tell me what the research shows in terms of what has caused feminism in terms, a patriarchal sort of society, what you think is causing that in areas that we may not be aware of, but also what is causing the racism in areas that we may not be aware of as well.
Look, I think that's a very good comment, and I think it is interesting. However, I think that like feminisms, we need to be talking there are many racisms, because depending on where you are, some people are going to be some groups are going to be dominant and others are going to be minoritized. So the difference is, like when you were, I'll just go back to your example, right?
Yep.
For you as a white woman going into Japan, you can always leave, right? And you will not be prevented from leaving. You're not there because you're looking for something like refugee status or, work rights. You have all those. Part of those reasons you've got those is because you're white. Mm-hmm. You're from a white European ex-colony. We have the power. First world countries are white. Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
So that idea of European and, white supremacy helped people take over land of others. That's how race does something. It's not even what it is. We need to be thinking what race does, what benefits it gives people, and who can manipulate it in order to serve political ends, economic ends. So it's not just about your intention. And not everybody is harmed or benefits from it. Very often, it's the people at the very top echelons who benefit from all this. None of us ordinary people actually get much out of it. But we're just kind of conditioned to think that way, the stereotypes. So when you talk about the billboard, if you've grown up all your life, like I was born in Sri Lanka, and even in my country, I'm quite dark-skinned. And as a girl, to have a darker skin is a really bad thing. So I picked up those vibes from the minute I was born. If I was a boy, I would have been treated differently. Not particularly my parents, but maybe the whole of society. So you walk into something and that's the conditions you're in. So dark skin and light skin is a really important marker of difference. And so according to that, people get pushed into different categories. The most important thing about is power. So as a white woman in Japan, you still have considerable power. You've got a visa, you can turn up anywhere, get a stamp because you've got an Australian passport or a British or Canadian or, all those countries are white first world countries. If you had a Pakistani passport, if you had an Asian, Chinese passport, it may not be so easy to get in. So these are what we talk about, the privileges awarded through the system. Doesn't matter whether you want to or not. Most things are unintentional. However, they really matter.
Yeah.
And they don't matter to some people as much as they matter to other people. So the lower down that ladder you are, the more it matters to you what your race is. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so what about the research underlying feminism, and why it because, I mean, look, because most of us have ideas. We have ideas as to why a patriarchal society has come into being, but none of us really know what the research says. Well, very few of us.
Yeah. So I deal with this thing called intersectionality. And a lot of people don't really understand. It's bandied around. It's one of those funny words, but it's actually not just one reason. So basically, different systems of power. So we've talked about racism being a category, a system. We talked about gender and being a system. Patriarchy is a system. So we've got to bring into that mix capitalism as well. So a lot of money is made, for example, by oppressing women and making us feel that we can't have the same income as men, keeps us at home doing all that labor for free, right? Which means that people who do go out there to work, and the companies that are owned, most of the companies are owned by men, but they're usually white men too, they can benefit from the free labor. So there's always money, there's always capital involved in both these. So it's the same. So that what we talk about is all these systems that go together, they're not operating independently. So we can't just, so what I find difficult about, so in terms of feminism, what I studied, I did some research with women from the African continent seeking asylum. So I did my master's and my PhD in Ireland. They were seeking asylum, but the minute they landed in Ireland, they were racialized. They had not been racialized any other time in their life. They were from Africa. They never said, well, I'm African, I'm not black, so then they turned up, and because they were black refugees, they were locked up, they were over-policed, they were questioned, why are you really here? When really the asylum laws applied to them, they come from war-torn countries or whatever. It's a law that's available. They are allowed to seek asylum, but they were treated differently. And I think what's really interesting is right now, there's another war in a white country, and those refugees are not treated the same way. So there you can see the different treatment because of race. That is what race does. Now, being a woman, on top of that, being a woman of color, a black woman, there are all these other questions about your fertility, about your sexuality. All these things become up for grabs, so a lot of kind of rape and, attacks. And I don't know how heavy you want this to get to, but women's studies, when you do feminism, you are dealing not just with who's going to go for the power breakfast, who's going to get to be the CEO of a company. I'm in it. I'm a feminist because of the people that are routinely deprived of any kind of dignity, rights, and freedom. So, and when you talk about hierarchies, we're talking about always black women, and in this country, Indigenous women, who are pushed to the ladder. It's not because they deserve to be there. So I'm working to dismantle those systems that routinely put people there. So my research will show you through, like I just did, I gave you an example, I studied it, I talked to the women. So feminist research is listening to what women have experienced. Our real experience of life is where we kind of make theory from. It's not the other way around. It's not like a top-down theory and you try and fit the women's lives into it. That is non-feminist research, and it doesn't work for us, right? Some trying to fit into a theory that someone has made up. Your real life can't fit into that. And that's why feminist research came into being, in order to do that work, in order to say, well, this is really what's happening. So why don't we just listen to women's stories and count that as equally important as, disciplinary knowledge like philosophy, and which are usually, as you know, created by white men, elite, really rich white men who have really high places in society. Yeah, so that bottom-up approach is what I would say is feminist research. So the research shows you what the powers are going on at the time that create those conditions. By doing that analysis, then you start to work out strategies that the women themselves have identified. How can you clear the way? How can you push back so that they can then progress with their lives and have the same rights and freedoms to work, to have raised their children, to send their children to school, to walk safely at night, all those kind of freedoms and rights. Yeah.
And one of the ways that we know, as you say, power is the dominant force behind oppression, whether it's racism or whether it's a sexist, oppression. And financial abuse is something that you have researched, yes, and that you consult in. Can you please tell us the different faces of that?
Totally. I mean, the main reason why we become feminists is we see the violence, right? We see the poverty, violence, and lack of freedom. That is why we know something's wrong, right? So when I first moved back to from Ireland, and I worked with the Women's Service, and they'd been doing, the Royal Commission had just happened into family violence. And for the first time, they named financial abuse as a form of abuse. Most people think violence is when you hit somebody, but actually the worst kind of violence is the mental violence and the inescapable kind of violence that you can never get rid of. And so the way that violence was understood was it was just once it happened out of the blue. It's actually a pattern, and we're talking more about that now, of coercive control. So it's like a lot of things happen along the way, and money is one of the main things. So let's go back to what I was talking about. Capitalism is always money. So one of my mottos is always ask the money story, always follow the money, and always ask about money. So what we found, I worked in that field for about 3 or 4 years, and I did a major study on financial abuse by talking to the women who'd experienced it, but in different cohorts. Like some of them were young, some of them, it happened to them 30 or 40 years ago. And that's what I found from the research, that one thing that happens here can have an impact for the rest of your life. So, and it's money. They can get over the violence, they can leave the relationship, right? But from then on, then you've got the courts, and your property divisions, and not being able to get employment, and when you get, and maybe being a single parent and not being able to have childcare. So once you leave the violent relationship, what I found was people were having to face a whole bunch of other systems, and each of those, sexism got in the way, because they were thought, well, women aren't very good with money. Actually, they are very good with money, because they have managed on such little, to feed their children. It's like these myths and stereotypes about what women and money, they're not good at maths. It's rubbish, right? So these things make it difficult for women to identify financial abuse. So one of the things is we have to really identify it early, before it becomes intractable, before they've lost all their house and property. So if you've got a financial abuser, they might start with financial abuse, and then they might turn to emotional abuse, and then sometimes they might get physical. So they swap it around. It's not just one thing. So we need to understand violence as a number of things.
Oh, absolutely. And abuse is it comes in many shapes, forms, sizes, and shades. And financial abuse, I would also, add that, well, in my mind, it already is emotional abuse, because it is control. It is coercive control, and that is a form of emotional abuse. So yeah, there are very few isolated, exactly, sorts of things going on where we can say, right, this is what it is, that is what it is. And as you alluded to earlier, it's the intersectionality. It's how all of these things come together and then present in so many different ways, some subtle and some like clubs over the head, quite literally.
Absolutely. And I think that's really important, because the myths and the sexist ideas about women and money make them feel ashamed for the problem.
Yeah.
And then they can't talk about it. So then it's very, very pushed under the silenced. Same with sexual assault, same with racism. It's very difficult to talk about because it's uncomfortable for everyone. So it gets pushed in, and then that person blames themselves, keeps that silence going until it becomes unbearable, or they become at great risk. So that idea that violence is only one thing and it can be dealt with by just the law, is not really. So a lot of the work, so on two sides, I worked with developing financial capability programs for women where they could recover a sense of themselves and the dignity they've lost. Not just about managing money and doing a budget, right? They know how to do all that. It's about recovering from the emotional trauma of being sort of pushed down so low, the degradation for financial abuse. There's a recent study from America. A lot of this stuff happened in America first, and it's becoming more well known here. But of all the kinds of abuse, financial abuse is the most linked to depression and suicide, feeling suicidal. The fact is that you can never get over that because it has a permanent effect on your life for 20, 30, 40 years. Some of the women I met had their incident happening 40 years ago, but then the state didn't look after them. They couldn't get decent housing. They had to put their kids in a place that the kids felt deprived and ashamed of living there. They couldn't provide for them in the way they'd wanted to. So that stacked on accumulated harm and lack of dignity is quite specific to emotional abuse, the emotional abuse part of family violence, of financial abuse. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, I would say that as you alluded to earlier, some people don't even recognize it because it's just been a part of their environment forever. And often these things are, intergenerational. And what we see our parents model to us, well, that's the normal. So often, not always, obviously, but often. But I would say that, we can change it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing this work as well. But we can change it. And also we can change, because our brains are plastic, we can change the neurological patterns that cause those things to happen over and over and over and over.
That's right.
We can change them. We can rewire. But until we rewire, they will keep happening because our mind seeks coherence.
Yeah, it does. It tries to make sense, doesn't it? It absolutely tries to make sense of the situation. Now, what we're missing here in the middle is the services, right? When you've gone through this, where can we create spaces where this work can be done? Yeah, that's the key. And can be done in a way that doesn't replicate all those norms, like, oh, you're just not good at managing money, you spoil your kids too much, that's why you can't make the money last. They don't have enough money to go around, to these women. Some of the women who I've worked with, absolutely lack of income is the problem, not because they can't manage money. So what we need is what we're trying to do, and that is where the feminism comes in, the feminist framework. Rather than saying you've got to change because you have to manage money. Hey, you didn't want this to happen, and all these systems are working against you. And can you see them? So we name the systems and we actually start to understand, well, if the bank doesn't give, when you went to sign that loan with your ex-husband, they did not get your signature. They didn't ask you any questions. Therefore, you signed the loan and then he ripped you off of that money. So can you see that was a problem with the bank, right? Their systems aren't correct. So then we work with the banks. So we've worked with industry and banks and bills and fines. We work on that side, trying to change that part of it. And with the women knowing what is available, how they can seek that and support them to go and seek that help that will then get them on a recovery trajectory. But it's very rare to make back the money that people have lost. It's actually really horrible. And for example, when you have a divorce, often you'd be amazed at what my research found, that so many of the abusers, financial abusers, are accountants, bank managers, usually quite powerful and well-off men. Women do financial abuse. It does happen in same-sex relationships. It can happen in elder relationships, adult children of an elder. So when you see it, then you start to see it in different places, and then you realize what can be done. So the woman, so many of the cases that when they did have a property or they'd shared, they had lost all their share through the legal process. So lawyers that needs to change. In Europe, family law is not adversarial. Can you believe that? It's British law that is adversarial. So in Europe, it's not about you have to put this one down. It's about how we're going to solve this. So that is one of the key things that could be done, but we can't change the laws here,
I think, and that's partly why, a lot of the best family lawyers and the best, but I mean, most ethical and moral, and, they're also mediators. And that is their first approach, is trying to mediate and get a good outcome for their clients without having to go through the whole legal process, because they know it's going to be financially crippling.
Yeah, I agree with that. So now we were talking about race and gender, so when you talk about, like, for example, some of my interview research participants were Asian women who were not believed by the police, right? So it's not just mediating, it's the entire process from beginning to end that doesn't serve Indigenous women, it doesn't serve migrant women, it doesn't serve people who speak a different language, even though they could be a doctor or whatever in their own country, because they are women and because they are women of color. Right from the police interaction when they're called, you can find that the male has a lot more power. And so the laws of family violence need to be looked at as well. And the entire who's involved in it. It's not just the lawyer saying, it's the police force, it's all those systems that address it, you know. So a lot about for me, the solution for that is to listen directly to the people that have experienced it. Otherwise, you will not get the full story. Of all the things that happened on the way. In fact, my doctoral research was called On My Way. It's like it's a journey. And at every step of the way, you'll find racism, sexism, visa categories, economic, you know, and that is how women end up from here and end up there. It doesn't just happen because they're not good enough. So that like, think about it as a journey is one of the main, I think, things to be thinking about. And at any point in that journey, you can do something, but you need to know that journey so that you can see what is the most effective response at that time.
And I think also, I mean, obviously, I am not the expert you are in terms of research and all that sort of stuff. But we also need to be, in my mind, very aware of the biases we hold against ourselves. And we've touched on that in terms of the things that we accept as normal, simply because they're normal and we can't imagine it any other way because that's what we've always experienced. But, you know, it's often the case, I find in my work, you know, that people are very unconsciously biased against themselves. And I think that's just something really important for us all to be aware of, is to keep questioning our own beliefs, our perceptions of things. And look, in closing, Nilmini, is there anything that you'd like to add? You've given us so much food for thought and different ways of looking at situations through you know, different eyes and different ways of questioning and seeing how things are all interrelated. Is there anything you'd like to add, perhaps for the women who are listening?
Yes, absolutely. Look, what you were saying about the internalized oppression, the internalized racism, we feel it because we grew up like that, you know, and like I said, when I was little, you know, I was the only girl. So I kind of learned sexism and racism through my own childhood, right? As most of us do, is to believe that did happen. You know, it's not something, and it didn't happen because somebody was mean. It happened because the system conditions us to think that way. So, you know, I was always like, oh, she's so dark. So even now I feel that, you know, I will carry a trace of that, and I have to work very hard on self-love and healing. And I think there's a big industry that's created around trauma and healing right now. Some of those things actually don't work, and some of them don't work for women, right? And that is then the same thing. What workplace doesn't work for women? You know, even they right up to medical aids and, you know, different kinds of things. Seatbelts don't work for women. It's because the research is not listening and looking at women's actual lives. So that bias has to be created from the outside, but inside, what do you do? I think authentic self-healing and authentic self-love is much, much more than just having a glass of wine with your girlfriends and going out for a dinner. That doesn't cut the mustard. It's deep self-love, and that's needed. And I think we need to be a bit careful about the trauma industry. For me, what's really helped is books. I run a little side thing called Loving Feminist Literature, loving being the operative word. And I read Black feminist texts because they are so full of love. They are written for you. It's like that woman is telling her story. She's telling you, this is what's going on for you right now. And then you find your place in that, where it's a place of empowerment, not a place of like confusion or aloneness. And so Black feminist texts and the ethics of love is a revolutionary ethics in feminism, which I don't think white and Western feminism deals with. Like Western feminism is very much about gender equality. People want equality with white men, you know? It's not about actual deep self-love. It's about financial equality. And so I don't really go into that. I find that's quite problematic. So I just so in terms of self-love, I'm also a Buddhist practitioner. So I do a practice called metta. So I would say Buddhism and feminism, for me, I keep myself clean in one way while I'm doing the political work, right? While I'm doing the critical, thinking critically, always pointing out the problems. But if you do that without a loving heart, you can end up causing more problems and more hate in the world, which is not what we want. So that self-love is huge. And to really understand trauma, there are some fantastic methods. And I think metta, the Buddhist meditation of self-love for women, is underutilized. So I would go and look up metta, M-E-T-T-A. And there are some very good practitioners in the US, women, people of color as well, not just white people. Buddhist practice and loving kindness. It's called loving kindness. Instead, we're taught to do mindfulness. We actually, that loving kindness hits it right at the right place. So I would say love, 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 but really understanding what one needs to do to cultivate it. I could not survive without my girlfriends, without my women friends, my sisters. We need places, find places where you can be truthful and honest. And whether it's not in the therapist's office, we need to be that kindness for each other and to ourselves. So I think from the inside all the way out, we've got to work at all those levels.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for being so candid and so open about both your experience and also the research that you've done, and yeah, for being so direct. It's very refreshing. Thank you.
We need to be able to speak our minds, because we have minds and they're very powerful and they're beautiful minds. Yep.
We absolutely do.
Thank you, Sally.
Thank you, Nilmini.
It was a wonderful opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you. And listeners, thank you for joining this conversation as well. You are just as important a part of this conversation as the people who are actually speaking here and now. So thank you for being a part of this and for being a part of our great community. And I'll look forward to joining you on the waves next time. Bye.